To complete our insight into the notion of this movement, it may further be noticed that the differences themselves are exhibited in a twofold difference. Once as a difference of content, one extreme being the force reflected into itself, but the other the medium of the matters. And again as a difference of form, since one solicits and the other is solicited, the former being active and the other passive. According to the difference of content, they are distinguished merely in principle or for us. But according to the difference of form, they are independent and in their relation keep themselves separate and opposed to one another. The fact that the extremes from the standpoint of both of these sides are thus nothing in themselves, that these sides in which their different essences were supposed to consist are only vanishing moments, are an immediate transition of each into its opposite. This truth becomes apparent to consciousness in its perception of the movement of force. But for us, as remarked above, something more was apparent. That is, that the differences, qua differences of content and form, vanished in themselves, and on the side of form, the essence of the active soliciting or independent side was the same as that which on the side of content presented itself as force driven back into itself. The side which was passive, which was solicited, or for an other, was, from the side of form, the same as that which, from the side of content, presented itself as the universal medium of the many matters. In section 140, Hegel is telling us that we need to further think out some of the implications of this bifurcation of force into multiple forces that are in some sort of reciprocal relation to each other. And he says that we can look at this in terms of form or in terms of content. As a matter of fact, we not only can look at them in either form, in either way, we need to look at them in both ways so that we can see how they connect up with each other. And we see that insofar as we're talking about content, we can talk about force as being reflected into itself on the part of either force, or we can talk about it being a medium of independent matters. And the force reflected into itself is correlative to the force as a medium of matters for this force over here, right? And vice versa. Either one can take on either position, and as we've seen, these are going to be mutually implied because the very act of being the medium is allowed to this because this is a medium for it as well. So the two forces are connected to each other in that way. Hegel's going to go on, and you notice that I've got this bar here. He's going to say that these two forces, when we look at it from the side of content, are not really separate from each other. They're distinguished from each other in principle or for us from the perspective of the thinking, conscious, perceiving, understanding subject, right? But not in themselves. When we turn to form, it's a little bit different. There we're dealing with activity and passivity. So we have the force over here as doing the soliciting, which is an activity upon the solicited, the passive force. But at the same time, it can only solicit, as we've seen, because this solicits it to solicit. So there's this endless, chicken-egg kind of thing going on there. Well, which one solicited first? Who pulled the gun out first? Who drew, right? And the answer is nobody. That's the way it works. They are set up in this relation to each other. So that considered from this side, this is the active one and this is the passive one. Considered here, this is the active one and this is the passive one. Now Hegel says that if we're thinking about it in terms of form, then we can say that these are indeed independent, separate forces. They are something different from each other, not already so deeply enmeshed with each other that we can't distinguish them. So he says, the fact that the extremes, from the standpoint of both of these sides, are thus nothing in themselves, that these sides in which their different essences were supposed to consist are only vanishing moments, are an immediate transition of each into its opposite. So each of these forces, in a certain way, becomes other than what it is precisely by the action or the receptivity of the other force. this force in a certain way becomes this force, and vice versa. And this chart here reflects the many different ways in which this is all happening at the same time, and which consciousness can then grasp in terms of form or in terms of content. So he goes on and he says, this truth becomes apparent to consciousness in its perception of the movement of force. But for us, something more was apparent. That the differences, as differences between content and form, differences of form, differences of content, vanished in themselves. And on the side of form, the essence of the active, soliciting, or independent side was the same as that which on the side of content presented itself as force driven back into itself, the side which was passive. So there's not only an interplay going on here and here, these are in an interplay with each other as well. So what appears to be active is in reality in a certain way passive. What appears to be passive is at the same time active. Things are more complicated than they originally appeared. So he says, the side which was passive, which is solicited or for another, was on the side of form the same as that which from the side of content presented itself as the universal medium of the many matters. We can correlate these together, and now what we're actually going to be doing for a little while is paying much more attention to what's going on up here to the side of form. From this, we see that the notion of force becomes actual through its duplication into two forces, and how it comes to be so. These two forces exist as independent essences, but their existence is a movement of each towards the other, such that their being is rather a pure positedness, or a being that is posited by an other. That is, their being really has the significance of a sheer vanishing. They do not exist as extremes which retain for themselves something fixed and substantial, transmitting to one another in their middle term and in their contact a merely external property. On the contrary, what they are only in this middle term and in this contact. In this, there is immediately present both the repression within itself of force, or its being for self, as well as its expression. Force that solicits and force that is solicited. Consequently, these moments are not divided into two independent extremes, offering each other only an opposite extreme. Their essence rather consists simply and solely in this, that each is solely through the other, and what each thus is, it immediately no longer is, since it is the other. They have thus, in fact, no substances of their own which might support and maintain them. The notion of force rather perceives itself as the essence in its very actuality. Force, as actual, exists simply and solely in its expression, which at the same time is nothing else than a supersession of itself. This actual force, when thought of as free from its expression and as being for itself, is force driven back into itself. But in fact, this determinateness, as we have found, is itself only a moment of force's expression. Thus, the truth of force remains only the thought of it. The moments of its actuality, their substances and their movements collapse unresistingly into an undifferentiated unity, a unity which is not force driven back into itself, for this itself is only such a moment, but is notion qua notion. Thus, the realization of force is at the same time the loss of reality. In that realization, it has really become something quite different. That is, this universality, which the understanding knows at the outset or immediately to be its essence, and which also proves itself to be such in the supposed reality of force in the actual substances. Now, 141 begins with saying that when we're analyzing the notion or the concept, the G.W.F, of force, what occurs is a kind of duplication or a splitting, a doubling. And we find now that we have force over here and force over here, and that both of these are existing, at least we think at the time, as independent essences, independent existences, independent things that are, and we're interested in their interplay with each other. We have to watch out from treating them as if we're looking just now at two substances that are arranged in a reciprocal relation to each other. Hegel's going to try to keep us from falling into that trap. Why? He says, their existence is a movement of each towards the other, such that their being is a pure positiveness, or a being that is posited by another. They really just possess being for an other. And whether we want to think of them as being the solicited or soliciting forces, if we're thinking in terms of form, or if we want to think of them as being force driven into itself, or force, that is a passive medium accepting the other force in terms of content, we see that both sides, in fact, provide that to the other, and it's difficult to say, which one is ontologically prior to the other. As a matter of fact, we can't say that. That's what it means for them to be reciprocal. So Hegel says that what that really means is that neither one is substantial in itself, at least not at this point. What do we get then? He says, they do not exist as extremes which retain for themselves something fixed, substantial, transmitting to one another in a middle term. Just like, if I am affecting this book, right? I am one thing, this book is another thing. Now I, bop the book, right? It makes a sound. I turn the pages, I affect it. I rub chalk on it, that was kind of dumb to do. It's obscuring the print. I didn't think the chalk would stick. Sometimes you get surprised by things. In any case, you see what we're talking about here. The action or what's going on is the middle term. The book is one of the substances. I am the other substance, and I'm doing something to it. Hegel's saying, no, it doesn't work that way with forces. There is a middle term. And that middle term is going to turn out to be awfully important. It's going to be where the substantiality is going to actually reside. So he says, on the contrary, what they are is only through this middle term. The force relates to the other force through this middle term. This force relates to its opposite force through the middle term. So the question that we want to ask is, well, what is this middle term? He says, in this, there's immediately both the repression within itself of force or its being with itself, being for self, as well as its expression. Force that solicits and force that is solicited. So these moments are not divided into two independent extremes offering each other only an opposite extreme. Their essence occurs rather simply in this. Each is through the other. What each is, it no longer is because it is the other. So these two extremes are unable to support themselves except through this middle term. What's that middle term then? Well, if we think about this, we could go to the text, and we will in just a moment. What have we originally talked about in section 136 when we started talking about force, and then started to progressively leave out of the picture over the last couple paragraphs? Think about content. We talked about the force as having two sides to its content, the force in itself, the force as the medium. What unites those two? Well, the force's expression. It can't come out of itself into the medium. The medium can't function as a medium for something to come into it unless there is expression, the inner becoming outer at the same time. So this expression is what connects these forces together. It's what unites the passive and the active on both sides. So he goes on and he says, they don't have any substance of their own that might support them. The notion of force rather preserves itself as the essence in its very actuality. Force as actual, the notion of force as actual, consists in the expression of the force. How do you know that there's actually a force happening? Because it does something. Because something affects something else. It exerts some sort of I don't want to say force. It exerts some sort of power. There's a synonym there. It exerts some sort of effect. It makes something. It determines something. That's expression. That's externalization. That is becoming outward. So he says, this is nothing else than a supersession, that is an Aufhebung of itself, a going to a higher level. In a certain way, you can say, well, the expression isn't really the force itself. The force itself is that thing that's like bound up inside of itself, or it's that thing over there that's the medium. But you only get those through the expression. So the expression is really more important from a Hegelian point of view. He says, the actual force, when thought of as free from its expression as being for itself, is force driven back into itself. But this determinateness is only a moment of force's expression. You only have force driven back into itself because you have a force that is expressing itself in some other force that's a medium. You only have a force acting as a medium because you have a force expressing itself. So without expression, no force. And expression is supplying us with the notion of force, or as he's going to say, the notion as notion. So he says, thus the truth of force is going to remain the thought of it. The moments in its actuality, their substances, their movements, collapse unresistingly into an undifferentiated unity, a unity which is not force driven back into itself, but it's notion qua notion. The notion qua notion is not yet developed for us as notion. It's, you might say, stuck in its objective status. It's not yet been made subjective for us by bringing us into it, as we're going to see happen a bit later on. But we've taken away a very important clue about the nature of force, this thing about expression. So he says, the realization of force as no longer connected with our view on it, but just force in itself, turns out to be its loss of realization. The only thing that is allowing us to keep a hold on force itself is the fact that we are trying to work out its notion. We are attending to its expression. He says, in realization, it's become something quite different. That is, it's this universality which the understanding knows at the outset, or immediately to be its essence, and which also proves itself to be such in the supposed reality of force in the actual substances. So again, the emphasis is going to be on expression. What is really happening? What is phenomenal for us? What are we taking in? What is presenting itself to us? That's going to be the reality of force. That is going to be the essence. That's going to be, as we're moving our way into it, the unconditioned universal starting to show itself. Insofar as we regard the first universal as the understanding's notion in which force is not yet for itself, the second is now force's essence as it exhibits itself in and for itself. Or conversely, if we regard the first universal as the immediate, which was supposed to be an actual object for consciousness, then the second is determined as the negative of force that is objective to sense. It is force in the form of its true essence, in which it exists only as an object for the understanding. The first universal would be force driven back into itself, or force as substance. The second, however, is the inner being of things qua inner, which is the same as the notion of force qua notion. In this short section, number 142, which is rather dense, rather packed, Hegel is bringing things to a knot. We've seen this happen many times before. He's going to be drawing things to a kind of a close, only for them to open up again. And what he's talking about here are two different universals. There's been a transition that's taking place throughout these previous paragraphs. He says, insofar as we regard the first universal as the understanding's notion in which force is not yet for itself, the second is force's essence as it exhibits itself in and for itself. So what does that mean? Remember, what we've got when we're talking about being for itself is a kind of relation, a reflexive relation that something has to itself. This is something that we see characterizing consciousness. We saw it earlier as characterizing universals, characterizing the thing. They have a relation to themselves. And force has not, at that point, been brought to the point of having this relation to itself. It had a relation to its other, but it's not yet to itself. And now we've made a transition to grasping force's essence in and for itself. Whenever you see that in and for itself, what we're talking about there is the kind of status, metaphysical, that characterizes something with substantial being, something that genuinely is, at least at that point in the dialectic. It often turns out not to be so in the next paragraph. Hegel's going to characterize this another way as well. So what we're beginning with, or what we had earlier, is force as an immediate, actual object for consciousness, as the immediate, as that which was presenting itself to us. And, as we always see, Hegelian immediacy always ends up being mediated, and when we need to look at the mediations, here you could go right back to the preface and see, going from the immediate to the negation of it. We have the negative of force, the negation of force, the saying, no, it's not that, as an object for sense, as something that's perceived by the senses. And we realize that force, in its essence, is for the understanding. You're not going to be able to perceive force just through sense certainty, just through perception. We're going to see him talking about that later on. Instead, it requires the work of abstraction or imagination, or doing something with the understanding that goes beyond the merely sensible to the, as he's going to say later on, supra or above sensible. Now that's going to get coalesced into the sensible. There's a lot more to be said about that, but I don't want to ruin the ending for you, at least in this chapter. Another way to think about this is we've been looking at force as if it's a substance, and now we start to realize that we need a more supple, a more sophisticated conception of force, so that we can get to the notion of force as notion. The notion of force as notion is going to have to do with this being in and for itself, but also for it being for consciousness, just not being for consciousness or being for the understanding in the way that it was over here. Another way of getting at this is to talk about trying to reach the inner being of things qua inner. Beautiful formulation that he's talking about. We do have this sense quite often, many of us, that there's more to reality than just what we're seeing or sensing or what we're remembering, that there's something behind the appearances that we want to get at. We have this sense of that. Many people have had that conception throughout time. That is what Hegel is calling the unconditioned universal. That is what we have been in pursuit of, and that is where we are going to try to go now through these discursions, excursions, excursions and dissertations about force. So, what do we have here? We have the realization that we've made some sort of progress. Hegel's trying to chart out what that is. And now we have some new beginning points to start with. And we have a new goal adequately conceptualized before us, the inner being of things qua inner.